Imagine the person who humiliated you the most. Imagine them laughing while you lost everything. Now imagine the look on their face 10 years later when they are begging you for a job they will never get. They thought my silence was a weakness. They thought every blow they landed was a victory. They had no idea that while they were talking I was building an empire that would eventually bury their names in the dirt. This isn't just a story about surviving. It is a story about the most dangerous person in the room. The one who says nothing. Because when you stop talking you start winning. I said nothing when they hurt me. My success spoke for me. The rain in Seattle does not just fall. It possesses the city like a gray shroud clinging to the glass of the skyscrapers and turning the pavement into a mirror of misery. I stood on the corner of 4th and Madison feeling the cold soak through my cheap suit jacket. A jacket I had bought on sale because I was saving every penny for a future I thought was guaranteed. I looked up at the Miller & Associates logo glowing with a cold corporate blue and felt a physical sickness in my gut. In my right hand was a cardboard box wet at the bottom containing 5 years of my life. A stapler, a coffee mug with a chipped handle, a few notebooks filled with strategies they would now steal, and a framed photo of my mother, who always told me that hard work was the only path to dignity. She was wrong. In that building, hard work was just a resource to be mined and discarded like coal. I remembered the air inside the office just an hour ago. It was climate-controlled and smelled of expensive espresso and the arrogance of people who have never known a day of true hunger. I had been called into Marcus's office. Marcus was a man who wore his success like a weapon. His shirts were custom-tailored, his teeth were unnaturally white, and he moved with the predatory grace of someone who had been told since birth that the world belonged to him. I walked in thinking we were going to discuss the Q4 projections I had spent 80 hours a week perfecting. I thought this was the moment I would finally be named junior partner. I had the data. I had loyalty. I had the results. But as soon as I saw Sarah sitting there, I knew the air had changed. Sarah was the director of operations, a woman whose smile never reached her eyes. She was a master of the corporate whisper, the kind of person who could ruin a reputation over a casual lunch. She looked at me with a performative pity that was more insulting than a slap. Marcus didn't even ask me to sit down. He stayed behind his mahogany desk fiddling with a gold fountain pen, acting as if my presence was a minor inconvenience in his busy schedule. He told me the firm was moving in a different direction. He used words like synergy and restructuring and fiscal optimization. These are the words cowards use when they are about to commit a robbery. He told me my services were no longer required. No thank you for the late nights. No recognition of the millions I had saved the company during the merger. Just a cold legalistic dismissal. When I tried to speak to ask why to show him the reports, Sarah interrupted. She said that my personality didn't fit the new culture. She hinted that there had been complaints about my lack of team spirit, because I didn't spend my weekends drinking at the country club with them. They were firing me because I was a worker and they were a tribe of vultures. They wanted my labor, but they hated my presence because it reminded them of how little they actually contributed. I felt a scream building in my throat. It was a roar of injustice that started in my chest and burned my lungs. I wanted to flip that mahogany desk. I wanted to grab Marcus by his silk tie and remind him that I was the one who saved his reputation when the audits came back red. I wanted to look at Sarah and tell her that I knew about the kickbacks she was taking from the vendors. I had the words. I had the ammunition. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The silence in the room was heavy and suffocating. They were waiting for me to explode. They wanted me to beg or shout or cry because that would validate their decision. If I got angry, I was an unstable employee. If I cried, I was the weak link. But then something strange happened. A coldness washed over me. It was as if a fire had been extinguished by a sudden flood of ice. I realized that words are the currency of the desperate. If I spoke, I was giving them more of myself, and they had already taken enough. I looked at Marcus. I looked at Sarah. I didn't let a single muscle in my face twitch. I didn't blink. I let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable for them. Marcus shifted in his chair. Sarah looked away at her manicured nails. I simply picked up my box, turned my back on them, and walked out. I didn't say goodbye to the receptionist. I didn't look at the colleagues who were suddenly very busy looking at their monitors as I passed. I walked into the elevator and watched the floor numbers count down like a countdown to my own disappearance. Now standing in the rain, the weight of the box was getting heavier. I walked to the parking garage to my 2012 sedan, which sat like a stain among the Teslas and Mercedes. As I reached my car, I heard laughter. A group of them was coming out of the lobby heading to an early happy hour to celebrate my departure. Sarah was in the middle of the pack, her loud artificial laugh cutting through the sound of the rain. She saw me. She pointed and whispered something to the new intern, a kid whose father was a senator. They all looked at me. It wasn't just a look of triumph, it was a look of total erasure. To them I was already a ghost. It was a cautionary tale of what happens when you think hard work is enough. Sarah walked toward me, her heels clicking on the wet concrete. She stopped a few feet away, shielded by a large black umbrella. She told me that I should take this as a lesson. She said that some people are born to lead and some are born to be the floor. She told me that I would never work in this city again because she would make sure my name was synonymous with failure. She called me a loser who didn't know how to play the game. She waited for my reaction. She wanted a scene. She wanted me to give her a story to tell over martinis. I looked at her. I saw the pores in her skin, the expensive jewelry that couldn't hide the emptiness of her soul. I felt the rain soaking through my shoes. I could have told her that I would see her in hell. I could have told her that she was a fraud. Instead, I did the one thing she wasn't prepared for. I smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a man who had just seen the end of the world and realized he was still standing. I said absolutely nothing. I got into my car, closed the door and drove away. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. The drive back to my studio apartment was a blur of gray streets and red brake lights. The apartment was a small box in a part of town where the sirens never stopped. I sat on the floor because I had sold my sofa months ago to cover my mother's medical bills. I looked at the cardboard box. I realized that my entire identity had been tied to a lie. I had been a good employee. I had been a team player. I had been a reliable man. And all it had gotten me was a wet box and a bank account that would hit zero in 3 weeks. The anger came back then, but it was different. It wasn't the hot, explosive anger of the boardroom. It was a cold, calculated rage. It was a transformative energy. I realized that the reason they could hurt me was because I was playing by their rules in their stadium. I was a gladiator, fighting for the amusement of emperors. I decided right then that I would never speak another word in my own defense. I would never explain myself to a soul. I would never seek validation from the people who sought to destroy me. I stood up and went to the window. The city lights were blurred by the rain. I saw the Miller and Associates building in the distance, its blue light mocking me. I whispered to the empty room that they had made a mistake. They should have finished me when they had the chance. By letting me walk away in silence, they had created an enemy they couldn't see. They had given me the ultimate gift, the freedom of having nothing left to lose. I went to my laptop. My hands were steady now. I opened a new document and labeled it, "The End." It wasn't a suicide note. It was a blueprint. I began to list every weakness I knew about the firm, every client they had neglected, every legal loophole they were exploiting, every technological gap they were too lazy to bridge. I realized that while I was working for them, I was also inadvertently learning how to destroy them. I knew the architecture of their empire better than they did because I was the one who laid the bricks. I looked at the clock. It was 2 a.m. For the first time in years I felt awake. Truly awake. The silence of the apartment was no longer lonely. It was a workspace. I realized that from this moment on my life would be divided into 2 halves. The half where I talked and hoped and failed, and the half where I stayed silent and executed. I deleted my social media profiles. I changed my phone number. I cut the tether to every person who knew me as the hardworking loser. I was going to become a ghost. And by the time they felt my presence, it would be far too late to stop what was coming. The breaking point wasn't the firing. The breaking point was the realization that I didn't need a seat at their table, because I was going to build my own house. The silence of a basement apartment in the dead of winter is a sound all its own. It is the sound of pipes humming with icy water, and the distant muffled heartbeat of a city that doesn't know you exist anymore. For the first 6 months after the office door closed behind me, I existed in a state of self-imposed exile. I had moved from my studio to a windowless basement unit in a rougher part of town where the rent was paid in cash, and no one asked for a resume. This was the laboratory of my rebirth. I had stripped away everything that made me a member of polite society. I stopped shaving. I stopped buying coffee. I stopped looking at the sun. My world was the blue glow of 3 second-hand monitors and the infinite scrolling lines of code that would become my vengeance. The grind is not a glamorous thing. The movies make it look like a montage with fast music and quick cuts, but the reality is a slow, grueling erosion of the soul. There were days when my hands shook from too much caffeine and not enough bread. There were nights when I stared at a single bug in my algorithm for 14 hours straight until my eyes bled and the letters on the screen looked like ancient runes. I was building a high-frequency trading bot integrated with a predictive AI that focused on the exact market niche Marcus and Sarah's firm dominated. I knew their rhythms. I knew they were over-leveraged in mid-cap tech stocks. I knew their stop-loss triggers. I was building a mirror that would reflect their greed back at them until it shattered their bank accounts. I remember the first time I almost broke. It was a Tuesday in November. I had $4 in my pocket and the heat had been turned off because of a billing error I didn't have the energy to fix. I sat there wrapped in a moth-eaten blanket watching my own breath mist in the air. I looked at my phone. I hadn't turned it on in months. I pressed the power button. A flood of notifications hit the screen like a barrage of insults. There were messages from my mother asking why I hadn't called. There were check-in texts from old coworkers that were thinly veiled attempts to see if I had hit rock bottom yet. And then there was a post from Sarah. She was standing on a yacht in the Mediterranean holding a glass of champagne. The caption said that success is the best revenge, and that she was grateful for the dead weight she had finally cut loose to reach this height. I stared at her face. That perfect practice smile. I felt the old urge to scream, to type a comment to tell the world she was a thief. My thumb hovered over the keyboard. My heart was racing. But then I remembered the promise. I remembered the power of the ghost. I didn't type a word. I didn't send a message. I didn't even let myself feel the anger. I simply turned the phone off and threw it into a drawer. I sat back down in front of the monitors. I took that pain and I channeled it into the code. I didn't need to tell her she was wrong. I needed to make her wrong. I needed to create a reality where her champagne turned to vinegar in her mouth. The grind became my religion. Every line of code was a prayer. Every hour of study was an offering. I began to study the giants of history who won through silence. I read about the silent partners and the shadow brokers. I realized that the loudest people in the room are the ones who are most afraid of being ignored. Marcus and Sarah needed the applause of the crowd to feel alive. They needed the titles and the galas and the social media likes. I realized that if I could live without the applause, I could take everything they had. I started working on Project Ghost. It was a decentralized hedge fund model that used an anonymous liquidity pool. No name, no face, no headquarters. Just a digital phantom that moved through the markets like a shark in dark water. I survived on the bare minimum. I became an expert at the economy of the body. I knew exactly how many calories I needed to keep my brain functioning for 16 hours. I knew exactly how many minutes of sleep I could take before I lost my edge. I was no longer a man. I was a machine designed for a single purpose. I watched the seasons change through the small high window of my basement. I saw the snow melt and the first sprouts of green appear in the dirt. I saw the summer heat bake the pavement. I didn't go outside. I didn't speak to anyone except the guy at the corner bodega when I bought my weekly bag of rice. He thought I was a junkie or a shut-in. I let him think that. I let everyone think whatever they wanted. By the end of the first year, the algorithm was live. It was small at first. I started with the $5,000 I had left from selling my car. On the first day it made $50. On the second day it was $80. By the end of the month I had doubled my money. I didn't celebrate. I didn't buy a steak. I plowed every cent back into the system. I refined the logic. I taught the AI to recognize the specific trading patterns of Miller and Associates. I saw their fingerprints everywhere. They were arrogant traders. They took big risks because they thought they were smarter than the market. They thought they were the masters of the universe. They didn't see the ghost watching them. I remember one night I saw a major move they were making. They were trying to corner the market on a specific semiconductor stock. They were pumping it up using their influence in the financial press. They were going to dump it at the top and leave the small investors holding the bag. It was the kind of move that had made them millions in the past. But this time I was there. I saw the buildup. I saw the fake news cycles. They were triggering. I waited until the exact moment they were about to exit. I used my liquidity pool to trigger a massive sell-off just seconds before their orders hit. The price plummeted. I watched the candles on the screen turn red and long like dripping blood. I saw the panic in the order books. I saw Miller and Associates trying to stabilize the price. They lost $40 million in 3 minutes. I made $6 million. I sat there in the dark watching the numbers tick up. My heart wasn't even racing. It was just a data point. I didn't call anyone to brag. I didn't post a screenshot. I just closed the laptop and went to sleep. The silence was my victory. Over the next year, the $6 million became 60. I moved out of the basement not because I wanted luxury, but because I needed better security and faster fiber optic lines. I moved into an industrial loft in an old warehouse district. It was still empty. No furniture. Just a bed, a desk, and my servers. I was now a shadow titan. I started hiring people through encrypted platforms. I hired the best minds in Eastern Europe and Asia. I paid them in Bitcoin. They didn't know my name. They didn't know my location. They just knew their user ID and the tasks I gave them. I was building a digital army. I watched Sarah's life through the lens of the data I collected. She had used her success to launch a boutique firm. She was taking out massive loans to fund a lifestyle she couldn't afford. She bought a mansion in the hills. She bought a fleet of cars. She was living the dream on a foundation of sand. I started buying her debt. Every time her firm needed a bridge loan, I was the anonymous source behind the shell company that provided it. Pictures of her empire to notice the walls closing in. The grind had changed me. My reflection in the mirror was that of a stranger. My eyes were hard and cold. My voice when I did use it was raspy and low. I had lost the ability to talk small. I had lost the interest in being liked. I had found something better than being liked. I had found the power of being the one who holds the keys. I remember standing on the roof of my warehouse looking at the skyline. I could see the tower where Marcus still worked. He was struggling now. The market was changing and he couldn't keep up. He was still trying to use the old tools of noise and bluster. He didn't realize that the world had been inherited by the silent. I spent those years in total preparation. I studied law. I studied corporate restructuring. I studied the art of the hostile takeover. I wasn't just a coder anymore. I was a predator. I knew that the moment would come when I would have to step back into the light. But it wouldn't be as the man they fired. It would be the man who owned them. The grind wasn't about the money. The money was just the scorecard. The grind was about the discipline of not saying a word until the word was checkmate. I had mastered the art of being nothing so that I could eventually become everything. My success was a silent mountain growing under the sea. One day it would break the surface and the waves would wash away everyone who ever doubted me. But until then I stayed in the shadows. I stayed quiet. I stayed hungry. I said nothing when they hurt me. I said nothing while I was winning. I would only speak when there was nothing left for them to say. The transition from a shadow to a titan is not a sudden explosion but a slow rising tide that swallows the shore inch by inch until the landscape is forever changed. By the 5th year of my silence I had moved my operations to New York City, but I did not choose a glass tower on Wall Street with my name emblazoned in gold. Instead I leased a nondescript floor in an old textile building in Tribeca. There were no signs in the lobby. There were no receptionists with fake smiles. Behind the heavy steel doors was a hub of pure intelligence. My team consisted of 35 analysts and engineers recruited from the fringes of the world. They were the brilliant misfits, the ones who didn't fit into the corporate mold of people like Marcus. I paid them 3 times the industry standard and in exchange they gave me their absolute discretion and their genius. We were a ghost ship sailing through the most turbulent waters of global finance and we were the only ones who knew exactly where the treasure was buried. The money was now a living thing. It was no longer about paying rent or buying food. It was a weapon of immense scale. I had reached a level of wealth where I could move markets with a single command. But I remained a ghost. I lived in a high-rise penthouse that was virtually empty. I had a bed, a table, a high-end espresso machine and a wall of monitors. I didn't own a car. I didn't wear designer labels with visible logos. I wore the same high-quality black t-shirts and trousers every day. I had eliminated the friction of choice. Every ounce of my brainpower was dedicated to the final phase of the plan. I was no longer just trading stocks. I was buying up the infrastructure of the lives of those who had discarded me. I started with Marcus. I knew he was the ego of Miller and Associates while Sarah was the venom. Marcus had spent the last few years trying to maintain an image of invincibility, while his firm's core business model was rotting from the inside. He had expanded too quickly into markets he didn't understand. He was addicted to the thrill of the deal and the praise of the financial media. I watched through the data as he took out massive lines of credit to fund a series of failing acquisitions. He was desperate to prove that he was still the king of the mountain. He didn't know that I was the one who owned the mountain. Through a series of offshore holding companies, I began purchasing his debt. When a bank wanted to offload a risky loan tied to Miller and Associates, my shell companies were there to catch it. I bought his corporate bonds. I bought the mortgage on his secondary vacation home in the Hamptons. I even bought the distressed debt of the construction company he had hired to renovate his office. I was weaving a web around him so intricate and so tight that he wouldn't even feel the threads until he tried to move. I was his landlord, his creditor and his eventual executioner, and he was still calling me a loser in his head whenever he caught a glimpse of an old staff photo. Then there was Sarah. She was more dangerous because she was smarter than Marcus, but her weakness was her vanity. She had started a boutique consulting firm that specialized in brand management and corporate culture. It was a front for high-level lobbying and influence peddling. She wanted to be a power player in the city's social scene. She threw gala dinners that cost $500,000. She donated to charities not because she cared but because she wanted her name on the donor wall. I watched her bank accounts bleed out to support this fantasy. She was a master of the fake it until you make it philosophy. But the problem with faking it is that eventually the bill comes due. I became the primary investor in the private equity fund that backed her firm. I sat in on board meetings via encrypted audio links with a voice distorter. She thought she was talking to a wealthy European conglomerate. She would pitch her vision with that same condescending tone she had used on me in the boardroom years ago. I listened to her talk about eliminating weak links and optimizing human capital. I stayed silent on the other end of the line, just listening to her voice. She had no idea that the weak link she had fired was now the only reason the company wasn't in bankruptcy court. I was feeding her just enough capital to keep her arrogant but not enough to make her safe. I was fattening the calf for the slaughter. The psychological shift in me during this period was profound. I had spent so much time in silence that I had forgotten how to participate in the noise of the world. I would walk through Times Square and see the thousands of people shouting into their phones, taking selfies and desperate to be seen. I felt like a different species. I realized that the greatest power in the world isn't fame or even money. It is the power of being the observer. When you are the observer, you see the patterns. You see the cracks in the armor. You see the fear behind the bravado. I saw Marcus's fear in the way he started selling off his personal assets quietly. I saw Sarah's fear in the way she increased her intake of anti-anxiety medication. They were terrified of the silence that was encroaching on their lives. Did I remember a specific night when I was invited to a high-stakes charity auction? I went because I knew they would be there. I wore a mask, not a physical one but the mask of a common man. I wore a simple suit and glasses. I stayed in the corners. I watched them work the room. Marcus was red-faced, drinking heavily and laughing too loud at jokes that weren't funny. Sarah was darting around like a shark looking for her next meal, trying to secure a contract with the tech mogul. They looked exhausted. They looked like people who were holding their breath, hoping no one would notice they were drowning. I stood 5 feet away from Marcus at the bar. He looked at me for a split second, his eyes scanning my face. There was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, a ghostly memory of a man he once bullied. But he looked away. He couldn't place me. To him I was just another face in the crowd. A nobody. I felt a surge of cold electricity in my veins. I could have whispered my name.
I could have told him that I was the one who had shorted his stock that morning. I could have told him that I owned his house. But I didn't. I just took my drink and walked away. The silence was too sweet to break. The revenge wasn't in him. The revenge was in the fact that I knew and he was powerless to stop me. As the months went by, the rising tide became a flood. The global economy took a downturn and the over-leveraged firms were the first to hit the rocks. Miller and Associates was hemorrhaging cash. Their clients were fleeing to my anonymous firm because we offered better results and lower fees. We were starving them out. I gave the order to my team to begin the final squeeze. We called in the loans. We triggered the margin calls. We began the legal process of seizing assets that I sat in my Tribeca office watching the screens. One by one the red lights started flashing. Marcus's firm was officially insolvent. Sarah's consulting group was being sued for breach of contract by a shell company I controlled. They were in total freefall. I received a dozen emails and calls from their lawyers begging for a meeting with the managing director of my holding company. They were looking for a savior. They were looking for a way out. They were still talking, still trying to negotiate, still trying to spin the disaster that I told my assistant to schedule the meeting for the following Monday. I told her to make sure the boardroom was prepared. I told her that for the first time in 5 years I would be attending a meeting in person. The tide had risen to its highest point. The shore was gone. There was only the deep dark water and me waiting at the bottom. I looked at the old cardboard box that I had kept in the corner of my office, the one with the chipped mug and the photo of my mother. I was going to take that box back into the Miller and Associates building. Not as an employee but as the landlord of their souls. I said nothing when they hurt me. I said nothing while I broke them. And now the silence was about to become deafening. The morning of the takeover did not feel like a day of triumph. It felt like the final surgical strike of a long and exhausting war. The air in New York was crisp and bitingly cold, a sharp contrast to the suffocating humidity of the day I was fired. I dressed with deliberate slowness. No power tie, no gold cufflinks, no symbols of the very ego I had come to despise. I wore a charcoal sweater and a dark coat. I looked like a man going for a walk in the park, not a man who had just dismantled a multi-million-dollar empire. As I sat in the back of the black car heading toward the Miller and Associates building, I watched the city wake up. Thousands of people were rushing to jobs they hated to serve bosses who didn't know their names. I had been one of them. I was the ghost who had returned to haunt the machine. When the car pulled up to the curb, I looked at the building. It was the same glass and steel monolith, but it looked diminished. The logo at the top, which used to feel like a crown, now looked like a tombstone. I walked through the lobby. The security guards didn't stop me. They didn't recognize me, but they saw the way I walked. There is a specific frequency of confidence that people react to, a quiet weight that demands space. I took the elevator to the top floor. My heart rate stayed at a steady 60 beats per minute. I wasn't nervous. You don't get nervous when you are simply reading the final line of a book you wrote yourself. The doors opened to the executive floor. The silence here was different from the silence of my basement. This was the silence of panic. This was the silence of a sinking ship. The receptionists were whispering. Analysts
were huddled in cubicles looking at screens filled with red numbers. I walked past them toward the main boardroom. I saw the plaque on the wall with the names of the partners, Marcus, Sarah, and 3 others who had laughed along with them. I pushed the heavy oak doors open. The room was filled with the smell of stale coffee and desperation. Marcus was at the head of the table, but he looked like a hollowed-out version of the man I remembered. His suit was wrinkled, his hair was unkempt, and there were deep dark circles under his eyes. Sarah was sitting to his left, her fingers trembling as she scrolled through her phone. There were 4 lawyers in the room and 2 representatives from the bank that held their primary debt. They were all arguing. They were talking over each other, trying to find a loophole and scapegoat a miracle. "Who are you?" Marcus snapped without looking up. This is a private meeting. We are waiting for the principal of the acquisition group. I didn't answer. I walked to the far end of the table and pulled out a chair. The screech of the chair on the hardwood floor was the loudest sound in the room. I sat down and placed a single blue folder on the table. The lawyers stopped talking. Sarah finally looked up from her phone. I watched the realization wash over her face like a slow-moving poison. First it was terror. "You," she whispered. Her voice was thin and cracked. Marcus finally looked at me. He squinted his eyes trying to place the face. He hadn't thought about me in 5 years. I was the dead weight he had discarded. I was the foot soldier. He looked at the lawyers then back at me. "Is this a joke? Where is the director of the holding company? We are here to sign the emergency liquidity agreement." I still said nothing. I opened the blue folder. Inside were the documents that detailed the ownership of every shell company I had created. There was the deed to Marcus's house. There was a lien on Sarah's firm. There was the purchase agreement for the building we were currently sitting in. I slid the papers across the table. One by one they picked them up. The room went cold. The silence was so heavy it felt like it was crushing the air out of their lungs. Marcus started to read and his hands began to shake so violently that the papers rattled. He saw my name. He saw the signatures. He saw the dates. He realized that for the last 3 years every dollar he had borrowed, every deal he had made, every savior he had found was actually me. I was at the bank. I was the landlord. I was at the market. He looked up at me and his face went from pale to a sickly gray. "This is illegal," he stammered. "This is predatory. You can't do this. We can fight this in court." I looked him in the eyes. I didn't blink. I let his words hang in the air until they felt pathetic. I didn't need to tell him that everything was legal. I didn't need to tell him that my lawyers were better than his. I didn't need to tell him that he had signed every document willingly because he was too arrogant to check the fine print. I just reached into the folder and pulled out 2 more pieces of paper. They were termination notices. Sarah began to cry. Not the quiet, dignified cry of someone who is sorry, but the hysterical sob of someone who has just lost their status. She started talking fast and desperate. She reminded me of the time she helped me with a client. She told me she was going through a hard time when she fired me. She blamed Marcus. She said she was just following orders. She offered to work for me. She offered to help me run the new firm. She was willing to betray Marcus right there in front of him just to keep her office. I looked at her and felt a profound sense of disgust. This was the person I had allowed to haunt my dreams for years. This was the giant I thought I had to slay. She wasn't a giant. She was a parasite. She was nothing but noise. I felt the urge to tell her how much I hated her. I wanted to tell her about the cold nights in the basement. I wanted to tell her about the rice and beans and the shaking hands. I wanted to see her crawl. But as I looked at her I realized that speaking would be a gift. Giving her my words would be giving her a piece of my soul, and she didn't deserve it. I had spent 5 years building a version of myself that didn't need their reaction. I didn't need their apology and I certainly didn't need their pain. My success was the only statement that mattered. The fact that I was sitting in that chair, and they were begging was the only conversation we were ever going to have. I checked my watch. I had been in the room for 10 minutes. I stood up. I didn't look at the lawyers. I didn't look at the bank reps. I looked at Marcus. He was slumped in his chair and defeated. He looked like he wanted to die. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small chipped coffee mug. The one I had taken in my cardboard box 5 years ago. I placed it on the mahogany table. It looked cheap and out of place in that expensive room. It was a reminder of where I came from and what they had tried to take. 10 minutes, I said. My voice was low and steady. It was the first time I had spoken to them. To clear your desks. If you are still in the building after that, security will escort you out. Any personal items left behind will be destroyed. Please, Marcus whispered. I have a family. I have a reputation. I didn't answer. I turned my back on them and walked toward the window. I looked out at the city I now owned. I heard them scrambling behind me. I heard the lawyers whispering about bankruptcy filings. I heard Sarah still sobbing as she gathered her things. I heard the door click shut. I was alone in the boardroom. The silence returned, but this time it wasn't the silence of the grind or the silence of the basement. It was the silence of completion. I sat in Marcus's chair. The chair I once thought was the ultimate prize. I realized it was just a piece of furniture. The power wasn't in the chair. The power was in the man who didn't need it. I had taken their empire not because I wanted to rule it but because I wanted to show them that it could be taken. I had dismantled their lives without ever raising my voice. I had won the war without ever firing a shot. I pulled out my phone and sent a single text to my team. The acquisition is complete. Liquidation starts tomorrow. I closed the folder. I left the chipped mug on the table as a monument to the man I used to be. I walked out of the boardroom and I didn't look back. I had said nothing when they hurt me. And now that I had won, I still had nothing to say to them. My success had spoken with a roar that would echo in their lives until the day they died. I walked to the elevator, pressed the button for the lobby, and began the first day of the rest of my life. The aftermath of a storm is often quieter than the storm itself. In the weeks following the takeover of Miller and Associates, the financial world was screaming. The headlines were filled with speculation about the ghost of Wall Street and the mysterious liquidation of one of the city's oldest firms. People wanted names. They wanted faces. They wanted a narrative of greed or a story of a corporate raider. But I gave them nothing. I declined every interview request. I blocked every journalist. I stayed in the shadows of my Tribeca loft watching the dust settle. I didn't want fame because fame is just another form of noise, and I had learned that true power lives in the stillness between the notes. I spent those first few weeks methodically dismantling the empire I had just acquired. I didn't keep the furniture. I didn't keep the prestigious name. I sold the assets piece by piece. I sold the client lists to firms that actually valued ethics. I sold the real estate. I took the millions that Marcus and Sarah had bled from the system, and I began to redistribute them. I funded scholarships for kids who came from neighborhoods like mine, kids who had the drive but lacked the connections. I invested in technology that prioritized transparency over trickery. I wasn't just cleaning up a company. I was purging a legacy. One afternoon, I decided to return to my old neighborhood. I didn't take the black car. I took the subway. I wore my old worn-out jacket and a baseball cap pulled low. I walked past the studio apartment where I had sat on the floor and cried 5 years ago. I walked past the grocery store where Sarah's boyfriend had offered to buy my food out of pity. I stood on that same sidewalk and looked at the world. It looked exactly the same. The buses were still loud. The air still smelled of exhaust, and people were still rushing toward their own tiny versions of success. But I was different. The man who stood there 5 years ago was a victim. The man standing there now was an architect. I found out through the grapevine what happened to Marcus and Sarah. Marcus had lost everything. Because I had purchased his personal debt, his bankruptcy was absolute. He had moved into his sister's guest room in New Jersey. He was trying to start a consulting business, but his name was toxic. In a world built on reputation, once you are exposed as a failure, the doors don't just close, they lock. I heard he spent his days at a local bar telling anyone who would listen about how he was betrayed by a former employee. He was still talking. Still trying to blame the world for the hole he had dug for himself. Sarah had fared even worse. Her vanity had been her undoing. Without the designer clothes and the galas, she didn't know who she was. She had tried to sue me for emotional distress, but my legal team had crushed the suit before it even reached a judge. She was living in a small apartment far from the city lights, working as a mid-level manager for a company she would have looked down on years ago. She was finally one of the foot soldiers she had mocked. Sometimes I wondered if she ever looked in the mirror and remembered the day in the boardroom. But I didn't wonder for long. I didn't have room in my mind for their ghosts anymore. I realized then that the true final word isn't a speech. It isn't a confrontation. It is the moment you stop thinking about the people who hurt you altogether. For years they were the center of my universe. Every line of code, every late night, every dollar earned was fueled by the memory of their faces. But as I sat on a bench in a quiet park, I realized that I couldn't remember the exact shade of Sarah's eyes or the sound of Marcus's laugh. They had faded into the background radiation of my life. I had won not because I had their money, but because they no longer had my attention. I decided to leave New York. The city was too full of ghosts, and the noise was starting to grate on my nerves again. I bought a house on the coast of Maine, a place where the Atlantic Ocean crashes against jagged rocks, and the only sound is the wind. It is a simple house made of wood and stone with a massive library, and a kitchen that smells of cedar. There are no monitors on the walls here. No stock tickers. No encrypted servers. I keep a single laptop in a drawer for when I need to manage my foundations, but most of my days are spent in silence. I walk along the beach every morning. The locals know me as the man in the black sweater. They think I am a retired teacher or perhaps a writer who lost his spark. They invite me to town hall meetings and holiday dinners. I usually decline politely, but sometimes I go and sit in the back and listen. I listen to them talk about their lives, their struggles and their small joys. I don't tell them about the millions. I don't tell them about the ghost of Wall Street. I just listen. There is a profound beauty in being a nobody, when you know you can be anyone. I thought about the 40-second hook that had played in my mind for years, the one about making them regret everything. I realized that the hook was for the man I used to be. It was the fuel I needed to get through the dark. But now that I am in the light, I don't need the fuel. I have the fire itself. I have peace. I have a life built on my own terms. I am no longer defined by the trauma of being fired or the glory of the takeover. I am defined by the quiet moments. The way the light hits the water at dawn. The feeling of a good book in my hands. The knowledge that I am free. If there is anyone out there listening to this story, anyone who is currently in their part 1, feeling the rain soak through their jacket and the sting of betrayal in their heart, I have one piece of advice for you. Stop talking. Stop trying to explain why you are right. Stop trying to prove to them that you are worthy. They aren't listening, and even if they were, they wouldn't care. Your words are a leak in your power. Close your mouth. Clench your teeth. And go to work. Build something so large that it eventually blocks out their sun. Create a reality so undeniable that it doesn't need an explanation. The world is full of people who want to be seen, but it is controlled by the people who are content to be invisible. Be the ghost. Be the shadow. Be the silent force that moves the mountains. And when you finally reach the top, when you are sitting in the chair they said you'd never sit in, don't look for them. Don't call them. Don't send them a message. Just sit there in silence and enjoy the view. I said nothing when they hurt me. I said nothing when I was starving. I said nothing when I was winning. And now that the journey is over, I still have nothing to say to them. I have reached the end of the story and the page is white and clean. My success spoke for me so loudly that I finally have the luxury of being quiet. The story doesn't end with a bang or a shout. It ends with a breath. A long deep breath of cold Maine air, and the realization that the silence was the greatest gift they ever gave me.